The questions I'll get from time to time, and honestly, this is a question that the church itself, I think, struggles with answering, is what is the purpose of church? Like, why do we do all this? Like, it sounds like it should be a simple question, but I bet you if I actually threw it out to the crowd, you guys would be like, right? And so my simple answer is usually, when someone asks me that, is to say, it's twofold. We are to make more and better disciples. All right, that sounds good. Now, it's worth noting, it's always dangerous to say things like that in front of confirmands, because they will follow up with, okay, so then what's a disciple? So I will say something like, well, a disciple is someone who is searching out Jesus in themselves and in their own lives and assisting others to do likewise. Right? So then they'll say, well, like, how do you do that? And that is a really good question. Because that is a question I think we as a church don't do a great job of answering. And we don't because we get so focused on Easter that we forget that Easter is both a day and a moment and a whole season, right? And see, the day and the moment is super important because if you don't get that Jesus Christ died and was resurrected for you because he loves you and he loves you before you were even born, then you're going to miss the boat. But once you get that, once you figure that out, once you accept that you are a loved child of God, there's another question. Now what? Right? Like, you've started the journey, but what do you do next? And to me, I think that is the power of the Easter season, which is how do we respond to the wonderful thing that occurred at Easter? How do we encounter Christ and do like so for others? And I think that's why we have these beautiful clues of what that means, right? Because throughout the Easter season, we're going to hear about all these folks post the resurrection running into Jesus before ascension, right? All these stories are going to be in that interesting, fascinating time period. And that answers to us, what did the apostles do? What did the women do? What did all these other people do once they realized the resurrection before Pentecost? Because we live, granted, after Pentecost, but spiritually we can easily live in that world of, well, what do we do now? We've at a deeper level understood Easter. What is the deeper response God has? So how does the church help? Well, you got to look at how people find Jesus. So today's story, they find Jesus through initially talking, right? They talk, they travel, they conversate. In fact, the person who really finds Jesus through talking is the women, right? You remember all those resurrection texts, right? Some group of women, Mary and some group, head on out to Jesus. They go to find the tomb empty. They hear an angel of the Lord tell them that Jesus has risen, right? And then, in most of the texts, they'll run into Jesus at some point very soon afterwards. But when they run into Jesus, they don't recognize him, right? Mary Magdalene thinks he's the gardener, which I personally find the funniest of all the scenarios. Or one of the other Marys will run into him and think that he's just a random person until they, quote, hear his voice. Right? And then they recognize Jesus. And so, we as the church try to help you encounter Christ in the spoken or in the written conversation. That can be through reading our Bibles, right? Sometimes God comes to us in language. Written language is language. It could be in preaching. Hopefully that happens at least every so often for you guys. It can happen in teaching, right? Teaching, any pedagogy at some level has some back and forth, right? There's some sort of conversation occurring. Even in a lecture, there's a conversation occurring in your own head as you think, what is this guy babbling on about? Right? And so for many of us, depending on our spirituality and our disposition, we connect to God through language, written or verbal, right? And so that's why we preach, that's why we teach, that's why we talk, that's why we encourage people to read their Bibles, because we want people to encounter Christ. And we know, for many, language is a way to encounter Christ. But that is not the only way we see people encounter Christ, right? We also see today's text, right? They chatted with Jesus for what had to have been the slowest 7 miles ever. Like, I am not a fast guy, but I can do 7 miles faster than an entire day, right? I don't know about you. Most of you can probably go faster than 7 miles per day, okay? So they must have been strolling quite slowly and chatting quite well as they're wandering there. I like to think they got so involved in their conversation they got lost a few times and were like, oh, I should have turned back there. Okay? But there is a moment where they finally realize what's occurring. They don't hear Jesus. They don't even hear Jesus when he studies the Bible with them. They hear him when he steps behind the table and breaks bread. And it's in that moment of ritual, in that moment of sacrament, in that moment, they get it. There's Christ. He's been right in front of me this entire time. And therefore, for some of us, depending on our disposition and depending on our spirituality, the time we most encounter Christ is in that ritual, in that tradition, in that sacrament, at that table, or at that font, or at that whatever it is. And so we, as the church, are here to gather folks together at those tables, at those fonts, to help people encounter Christ. People will ask me, why is it that I smile when I hand out communion? People have noticed that I'm always smiling. And I always say the reason I'm smiling is because in that moment, there is a miracle occurring. You could be at Starbucks eating a cake pop, but you're here eating communion. God's true self is really present in that moment between me and you and God. What is there not to smile about? A miracle has occurred. It's also why I smile when I do baptisms. It brings me great joy. But it isn't just in ritual, and it isn't just in language in which we encounter Christ. Remember good old Thomas from last week? Now, I personally think Thomas has gotten a bad rap this entire time. You all know that. I've said that many times before. But here's the thing. So assuming he's got a bad rap, he's a good guy, right? And so if he's a good guy, what is going on there? Well, he is standing there in great anguish and disbelief because of all the horrible things he just saw with the crucifixion, right? And what he wants to do is share his pain with Jesus and have Jesus show him the sacrifice he made. I want to put my hand in his side, my fingers in the holes in his hand, right? It is a representation of the pain and scars. Like when a whole bunch of guys get together and you've had a little too much beer and you're like, oh, back in the war, let me show you what I got. Right? There's a bonding that occurs. See, for many of us, it is walking in our pain and our times of grief, being able to share not just in the joy, not just in the ritual, not just in the conversation, but in the true human pain that is everyone's life. No one goes through life without pain. No one walks out of life without scars. And there's a true bonding that can occur when you can own up to the scars and see the scars in others. This is one of the reasons we walk and provide pastoral care and are there for each other. It is not just to support, though that's part of it. It is not just to care and show compassion, though that is part of it. It is not just because we love humans and humanity, that is part of it. But it is also that we know that in those darkest, hardest hours, if you can be vulnerable enough to show your scar and someone vulnerable enough to say, yeah, I understand, let me show you mine. It is in those moments, sometimes, that we find Christ. Now, the reality is that virtually no one is only one of these things. Virtually no one only connects this way or that way. It's not an exclusive thing. The reality is some of us will connect better one way or another, but we all connect to Christ through these. So as you go out in this Easter season, my hope for you is go be disciples. Go out there and search for Christ in all the ways Christ lives in this world, the ones we listed and the ones beyond. But also remember to help others see Christ too. Amen.